Well, welcome everyone to the June session of the Reading Pilgrimage Together discussion. We're delighted this month to have a special guest, Dr. Adam Guy, who will be talking about Deadlock and other aspects of this amazing work, Dorothy Richardson's 13-volume novel, Pilgrimage, which we're reading over the course of 2023. Or 2022, sorry. I'd like to do it again in 2023, but I might need some help if we're going to do that. Before we go to Adam's little talk and we have our discussion session, I just want to go through a short presentation of some key things just to update where we are. So let me do that. So here we are. This is our sixth session. Of course, we've had a couple of special sessions in January and May. Trying to exchange our ideas and reactions to this work through Twitter, primarily through using the Pilgrimage Together hashtag. I'm posting material on the Reading Pilgrimage website, which hopefully you'll find illuminating and helps you get through this challenging work. For June, we're on to, if you've got the, as most of us have, either the Virago or the Dent version of Pilgrimage. There you go. Yes, the nice thing is both editions use exactly the same pagination. So, and if you happen to have either or both of George Thompson's guides to pilgrimage, they refer to that pagination as well. So when somebody gets around to a new edition of Pilgrimage in this sort of format, it'll be interesting seeing how we approach, how whoever publishes that approaches that. So this month we're on to volume 3, the first book of volume 3, which is Deadlock. And our guest is Adam Guy. Just looking ahead, for July, I kind of planned that we wouldn't have a special guest so that we could just focus on open discussion. We're at the halfway point chronologically, if not exactly in the length and number of volumes in the book. So I think folks by this point have a lot of questions and we have opportunities to share our perspectives, because I think that's one of the great things we get out of this. This is, in my opinion, I read this solo, although very early on I was able to share reactions with Kate McDonald, who now runs Handheld Press. That was purely coincidental, but I think this is a work that you really do have to kind of read socially. So just take a moment to talk about July's discussion. I have not arranged for any special guests for this, which means in terms of scheduling, we have a lot of flexibility. Typically, we've been doing these on Wednesdays or Thursdays in the last week of the month, in the midday timeframe for those of us in the US, and the early evening timeframe for those in the UK and Europe. But we have some flexibility. We could do this on a weekend, or we can continue and stay with a weekday time, and also potentially shift the time of the day. Although I think this, it's kind of hard if we're going to, particularly if we want to make this available to any of our participants from Australia, we really kind of need to not go too late for the UK and not too early for Australia. So that only gives us a window of a couple of viable hours. But I just wanted to throw it open for discussion as soon as I'm finished with this, to see if anyone had preferences, strong feelings about perhaps shifting to a weekend day for doing that. So before I go to introduce Adam, I would like to just see, does anybody have any immediate reactions? And please feel free to go off mute and just jump in if you would be interested in doing a weekend session as opposed to a weekday session. Any feedback? Well, we don't have to decide right now or even in this session, but If you have strong feelings either way, please either message me on Twitter or send me an email, and we'll see if we can kind of get a rough consensus of how folks want to go. And let me just finish up by introducing Adam. Sorry. So we're talking about book 6. Now we're transitioning into the 20s, which is interesting. You know, at this point, the signs of modernism are going to become much more apparent, both to the readers of Deadlock and Pilgrimage, but also to Richardson herself. So I think that's an interesting transition point. And with that, let me introduce Dr. Adam Guy, who is joining us. He's one of the members of the advisory board for the Oxford edition of the works of Dorothy Richardson, and he's published a number of papers related to Richardson. And so he's a great resource. We really appreciate all of the support we've gotten from the Richardson scholars. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Adam, and welcome to our group discussion.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much, Brad. And I'm just so happy to be here talking to you. And I'm fully in agreement that it is probably the best way to read Pilgrimage collectively, because I think at points it might feel like you need a support group, and at other points you just need a kind of community to kind of enthuse about it with. So this is a great enterprise, and I have nothing but admiration for you for doing this. I'm very happy to be talking about Deadlock too, which I think is one of the most I think the densest and but also most fascinating novels of the sequence. And one of the things I enjoy about discussing Pilgrimage is the way that you involve yourself in two parallel timelines. So on the one hand, you have the timeline of the narrative itself, of Miriam Henderson's experience, of her growth, her development, her struggles, her changing sense of self, and so on, and ultimately maybe her coming to writing, because I think this is a kind of prehistory to the very writing of Pilgrimage itself in a way. And we track that chapter volume by chapter volume in this massive novel called Pilgrimage. But on the other hand, you have the parallel timeline to that, which is of Richardson's own life as a writer, publishing these novels, developing a reputation, and called on increasingly to write other things as part of an emergent culture that today we would call modernism. And she, of course, was a great innovator of European modernism. And I think that because Pilgrimage is a fictionalized autobiography, I think it's important to understand both of those timelines as we read, because even while we read Deadlock, which throws us into the intellectual life of London at the turn of the century, we're also implicitly with Richardson in the late 1910s and early 1920s, in that moment where she's recalling her own younger experience and transforming it into this amazing artwork. And so in that spirit, what I'm going to do in this little introduction is begin with that latter timeline, the later one, the one that's Richardson's present in the late 1910s and early 1920s, before introducing some of the themes of Deadlock, which is set in 1900 and 1901, so as to open up the discussion about the novel with you all. And I'm really interested to hear what everyone thinks about it. So to begin with Richardson writing Deadlock, Richardson spends much of 1919 in St. John's Wood in London, but in 1920 she spends most of the time in Cornwall, particularly staying in Rose Cottage in Trevone, which is near Padstow. And it was in this part of the world that she wrote most of Pointed Roofs, the first novel of Pilgrimage. And her letters of 1920 show that earlier moment in her writing career was in her mind as she was writing Deadlock. So I'd be interested to hear what parallels and linkages, I guess, people will find between Deadlock and Pointed Roofs. They don't seem like very similar novels at all in many ways, but I think in Richardson's mind there was a kind of link because of her personal situation. By the time Deadlock is published in, I think it's actually the number on the copyright page is 1921, but I think that from our research, it looks like it might have actually been sort of in people's hands in December 1920. Richardson had been a published novelist since 1915, so she was developing a reputation at this point. She's been reviewed by people like Virginia Woolf and Catherine Mansfield. And if you look at the newspaper reviews of Deadlock, it's clear that she's speaking to a readership who know her previous work and have kind of clicked into gear with the idea of this novel sequence. Richardson was also, I think, at this point in her life, working out what it means to be a full-time writer. In 1919, she'd written her final regular column for the Dental Record, a periodical which in some ways represented that earlier part of her career where she drew on her previous professional experience working for a dentist to get a writing job. But now as an established novelist, she could kind of throw that away and be more selective and turn her journalistic writing to more literary and cultural ends. To give you an interesting example of this, one thing Richardson does write for the Dental Record in 1920 is a review of Barbara Lowe's book, Psychoanalysis, a brief account of the Freudian theory, which is one of the earliest English language works about Freud and Freudianism. And this is a reminder to us, I think, of why Richardson was so important to the literary and cultural vanguard of her day, at the point at which her huge novel of personal experience and of inner life and of memory is in train, so too is Freudian psychoanalysis beginning to be understood and kind of fully engaged with in Britain. To be a full-time writer and an experimental writer like Richardson also means working out how to earn money from writing. And 1920 can be seen in some ways as the beginning of Richardson's development of an often precarious and slight portfolio of patronage and philanthropic support from those who wanted to help her in her ability to carry on writing. I mean, to put it bluntly, the royalties from Pilgrimage alone didn't pay the bills. From 1917 to 1920, Richardson's letters to her literary agent Albert Curtis Brown. Someone's talking in the background there. So, I mean, in the 1970s to 20, her letters to her literary agent Albert Curtis Brown Literary Agency exists to this day. They're characterized by kind of constant complaints about earning money from writing. And in the middle of 1919, Richardson had herself inquired about the possibility of serializing Deadlock, as she had with Interim, but to no avail. So instead, at this point in time in 1920, Richardson benefited in the end from the intervention of a pair of friends and admirers, the writers J.D. Beresford and May Sinclair, who were both excellent early writers on Richardson's art. In 1920, Beresford and Sinclair wrote to the Royal Literary Fund recommending Richardson for a grant. And in November, Richardson was awarded £75 to support her in her writing. I mean, an interesting fact here is that £50 of that came from the Royal Literary Fund, which still exists to this day, but £25 of that £75 actually came anonymously from May Sinclair herself. So when Deadlock was published, reviews appear across the next 6 months or so in the first half of 1921, and they are mixed. A review in the Manchester Guardian calls Pilgrimage Richardson's feminine epic and praises its unerring sense of atmosphere and relationships, which Richardson rightly denies to blundering men. This review also approves of the novel's, quote, subtle, involved chronicle of Miriam's critical moods, end quote. And this review from the Manchester Guardian is signed E.G., which I think is probably likely Edward Garnett, who was one of Richardson's staunchest supporters, and of course the editor who got Pilgrimage published in the beginning for Duckworth, and Deadlock is still published by Duckworth, so she's still in that publisher, so she owes a lot to him, and she often acknowledges that to him in his letters. As I said, reviews are mixed though, so some reviews are more critical. There's a really fascinating review in The Nation and Athenaeum, which is a very important journal for the emergent modernist writing in Britain. And it basically calls the novel dull, but at least it realizes this is what, this is something you just have to deal with Richardson. It says, quote, "We are being sacrificed as readers to Richardson's sense of fairness." The idea here is that because life is sometimes dull, so must Pilgrimage sometimes be dull. I think other reviewers are less understanding. So in The Observer, it describes, quote, "a mere literary mess," end quote. And The Spectator complains as follows, quote, What a pity it is that Miss Richardson does not add to it an appendix, a little argument which will tell the story of the book, so that we do not miss her vague felicity and accuracy by having to hunt amid her impressions for structural facts, end quote. I think that one significant aspect of even the more critical reviews, though, is that I think they do all recognize that Richardson is on the cusp of something and that she really is an innovator in what she's doing. There's a really fascinating Observer review that compares Richardson's technique to, quote, turning a kinematograph camera to each thought as they appear. And here it's talking about the cinema camera. There's also a Sunday Times review which considers Richardson's, quote, intimate photographic vision, end quote. And I think that it's interesting in 1921 to see that reviewers are anticipating what Richardson's greatest supporter, Breyer, later saw in Richardson's work, and what brought Richardson later in the 20s to be a regular contributor of articles on cinema to Breyer's pioneering film journal Close Up. These reviewers realized that Richardson's innovative literary technique is influenced by the changes in perception that are brought about by the new media technologies of the 19th century. What I'm going to do now is move on to talking about Deadlock. And I'm more interested to hear what everyone else says, but I'll give you my own kind of take on it. As you've probably seen, having read it, a lot of Deadlock is concentrated on, in various ways, on Miriam's emerging relationship with Michael Shatov. Richardson had kind of held back a concrete love interest from Pilgrimage for 5 books, so as to show that young women's lives can be plotted in different ways and that their experience in novels doesn't have to center around or aim at romance and marriage. But if on the surface it looks like that this has come to an end with Deadlock, then Richardson shows that to write about romantic and sexual relations between men and women, a writer doesn't have to slip into cliche. And I think for me, the relationship with Shatov is more of a springboard for Richardson to talk about ideas, to talk about literature, and to talk about politics. And I don't want to ruin it too much, but I think that the interesting thing about those conversations with Shatov that unwind across Deadlock is that they contain a lot of the germs of the bigger ideas and themes that develop as Pilgrimage goes on. So, for example, Deadlock contains the first use in Pilgrimage of the word socialist. And in some of the discussions with Shatov, we can already see how Miriam is headed towards Revolving Lights, the next novel, which is such a great novel about political experience. And I think even in Miriam's editing of Mr. Lahit's lecture, which I think are some of the funniest scenes in Pilgrimage, we have this other kind of tantalizing moment of the evolution of Miriam into a writer. And it's the same with the discussions of translation in that novel. We're starting to get a sense here that Pilgrimage is a novel about, as I said before, about coming to writing, and it becomes a kind of personal prehistory that led Richardson to start writing Pilgrimage in the first place. I think the other thing that characterizes Deadlock for me is that this is the first novel where Pilgrimage really opens itself up to what we might call collective and mass public space. And we have had those thrilling city scenes in The Tunnel and Interim, but in Deadlock, I think the city's met in a new way. And that particularly comes because it's met in a pair, with Michael and Shatov's conversations opening up the city in a new way. And I think also, Pilgrimage has in the main before been a novel of small scale spaces. So the private home, the living space, which has been opened up for a small gathering, the workplace, the cafe, even the narrow street. But suddenly in Deadlock, we get the British Museum reading room, the concert hall, the lecture theatre, places like that. And I think that this means something different for Miriam's sense of self, her sense of who she is and of how she meets the world. And along these lines, I wanted to read out a passage that encapsulates this for me. And it's, if you want to follow it along for me, it's on page 199 of the Virago edition or the Dent edition that Brad mentioned. And it's the scene where towards the end of the novel where Miriam and Shatov go to see Gounod's Faust, which was the kind of hot ticket at the London Opera in 1901. So it's just the central paragraph of the page 199. And it says this: after spending all of her available funds on an evening blouse and borrowing a cloak from Jan, she found herself at the large theatre impressed only by the collected mass of the audience. The sense of being small and alone, accentuated by the presence of little Mr. Shatov, neatly in evening dress at her side, persisted, growing until the curtain rose. So long as they had wandered about London and sat together in small restaurants, the world had seemed grouped about them, the vast ignored spectator of a strange romance. But in this huge enclosure, their small, unnoticed, unquestioned presences seemed challenged to account for themselves. All these unmoved people, making the shut-in air cold with their unconcern, even when they were hushed with the strange, appealing music of the overture, were moving with purpose and direction because of their immense unconsciousness. Where were they going? What was it all about? What, she asked herself with a crowning pang of desolation as the curtain went relentlessly up, were he and she to be or do in their worlds? What had they become? Committed, identified, two small, desolate, helpless figures with the crowding mass of unconscious life. And I just want to repeat some of those questions again from that passage. Where were they going? What was it all about? What, she asked herself, were he and she to be or do in this world? And I think that these are the kinds of questions that pilgrimage is starting to ask in new ways. I think one way that those questions are asked relate to the way that perhaps we all come round to thinking when we start an intimate relationship with another person. And that is, where is this going? Can I see a future with this person? And if so, what does that future look like? And it interests me that in Deadlock, the word future clusters around two specific moments in the novel. Nearly all of the iterations of that word appear in these parts of the novel. So the first part where we see the word future used repeatedly is in that, I think, brilliant small moment in the novel in chapter 3, where Miriam has her Christmas visit to see her family. And here the talk is often of marriage and how it seals up and sets a future in a particular way. There's that sort of strange discussion of the old man who's been in love with her sister Eve, and that's conducted as talk of the future. It says, quote, "Those wonderful letters were a bridge, a promise for the future." Again, another quote, it says, "If there were a future life you'll be watching for, Eve to walk gently and crowned with song and making everything sing all around her. But what of the wife and of Eve's future husband?" And through Gerald too, Harriet's husband, her other sister, there's at one point where he makes what Richardson calls a bantering acknowledgement about Miriam trying on a blouse. And the reflection that comes off of this goes as follows. She gazed out before her into the future, an endless perspective of blissful, unbroken silence, shielded by the gift of speech. I mean, here Richardson is thinking about the kinds of family bonds that open up through marriage so that two related people might have a conversation that crosses years and is only resumed occasionally in that long period of time. And this is what, in the meeting with her family, marriage represents. It's a new but almost sort of certain future that's opened up in a certain way. To contrast those, the sort of stable notions of futurity that Miriam encounters through her family, we have the much more uncertain future that's represented in the person of Shatov. So in the later stages of the novel, where the relationship starts to enter the deadlock of the novel's title, we get the long debate about gender and religious identity between Miriam and Michael. And this becomes a precursor to Miriam's discussion with Mrs. Bergstein that ends the novel. Now, Mrs. Bergstein is an English woman who's married a Jewish man. And ultimately, for Miriam, Mrs. Bergstein speaks in a voice, quote, that had something that was like a cold, clean blade thrusting into an intelligible future, something inexorable, founded not upon fixed ideas, but upon ideas single and cold. This woman would not make concessions. She would always stand uncompromisingly in face of everyone, men and women, for the same things, clear-cut, delicate, and narrowly determining as her voice. And what Richardson calls an intelligible future here is what Shatov cannot represent for Miriam by the end of the novel. And there's a lot in this realization that draws in some of the novel's more challenging and perhaps problematic reflections on Jewishness. Certainly Miriam's partial resistance to Shatov's Judaism teaches us something about Miriam and about both the time that Deadlock is set at the start of the 20th century, but also about the time when it was being written at the beginning of the 1920s. The novel ends with Miriam fleeing towards what Richardson calls the, quote, darkest center. the relationship with Shatov. But fortunately, the next novel, albeit for readers in the 20s, I think another few years in the making, the next novel moves from this darkness to a set of revolving lights. So perhaps all is not lost. But at this juncture in the novel, I think the idea of a future is something that troubles Miriam, and I think that that's one of the really interesting aspects of this novel, like what it means and feels like to be in deadlock. So that was my brief introduction and reflections on this novel, and I think I'll pass back to Brad and to hear what the rest of you say now.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. Yeah, I have to say that reading it, Deadlock, the second time through, initially you kind of hit this wall of conversation and reflection. But by the end of the book, there's so much going on that it's just stunning. Like that passage that you just read where they're in the opera house. I mean, that's one of those where I highlighted it and said, this is one of the great passages. Just this paragraph is such an amazing paragraph, because where do you get those moments where, I mean, we've all had that moment where you're in a crowd and you look around and think, am I really an entity? If you're in a big crowd, it's very easy to start questioning your sense of self fundamentally. So, and 2 pages on, there's another amazing thing. So if you don't, I mean, we can go in so many directions, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation at all. But I want to make sure that in the course of today's discussion, I think, first of all, I really appreciate you bringing up the point about spaces and public places, because if anybody has gone on to Revolving Lights, it opens with just this stunning paragraph where she is going into a lecture hall and realizing, just what the experience of being an individual in a large public space is like. So there's going to be more to come in that regard. The other thing, though, and there's been a little bit of reaction on Twitter, is one of the moments in Pilgrimage as a whole that today's readers tend to hit a big speed bump with, which is the scene in the cafe in the East End where she sees a Black man eating and has such a powerful reaction to that. So I know other folks may want to discuss that as well. So I don't want to, please, folks, feel free to come off mute and chime in. But I wanted to throw that to you, Adam, specifically, and hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I mean, I think that it kind of joins up that moment with other moments earlier on in the sequence. So I think that Becky Bowler mentioned them, for example, in the tunnel, for example, this sort of slight but consistent occasional insight into Miriam's prejudices and her kind of racializing instincts in relation to certain kinds of racial otherness. And I think I agree that today I think they're very difficult and uncomfortable to get a handle on. And I think that it's a difficult thing to talk about, because on the one hand, I think that one of the things that Pilgrimage has is the idea of being so deeply rooted in an individual's consciousness. And one of the kind of literary tricks that Richardson has is the idea that she can allow Miriam to be wrong about things, so the kind of naivety that you see in her character in all kinds of respects is something that Richardson has that incredible control over, and that kind of confidence to let her reader work out that Miriam might not be making the right choice or perceiving something entirely correctly with. And I think that, part of me wants to write it off for that, but at the end, but at the same time, I don't necessarily think that these kinds of instincts are resolved towards the end of the sequence. So there's not a moment where she realizes that she was wrong, basically, and that maybe one shouldn't view some difference in that way. So it's a difficult thing to deal with, but it also fits, I guess, into the kind of matrix of Deadlock in relation to her perception of Shatov and his Jewishness, which is another kind of difference and otherness which she comes up against. And I guess that will be one way I would read that scene, within this kind of framework where Miriam is working through what it means to sort of encounter difference, basically. But at the same time, that almost sounds like him kind of defending it, and I think I'm with the readers. I haven't seen the Twitter comments, but I'm totally with the readers who would say that today I think that it rings an ugly note in this novel, as those other moments, for example, in the tunnel do, that I couldn't excuse.
Right. Well, absolutely. And there have been a couple of papers. Well, there's a MA thesis that's available online, and also a paper that was in the Journal of the Richardson Society that specifically dealt with Richardson's attitudes towards race, let's say that. And there's some fascinating perspective. What I didn't get the first time reading through, but certainly came out the second time, was essentially that Miriam seemed to be mentally drawing a parallel between the status of Blacks after the abolition of slavery and the status of women in society, that essentially eliminating a legal constraint didn't make everything wonderful. It's still, there were still many other aspects of the constraints upon on Blacks and also on women's. Well, we have Phyllis has raised her hand, so please, go ahead.
Just to very briefly jump in along that line, and I'll take the question in a second, but there's a great article, I can't remember the title, by Jacqueline Rose about Jewishness in Richardson's work, which is sort of very relevant to these conversations. I think it's on the secondary bibliography on the DorothyRichardson.org website for anyone who's interested. But I'll take the question.
Yeah, let me just say for those of you who are following, what I think after this, I'm going to make sure that I post links to these various articles on this aspect on the Reading Richardson site. So, Phyllis, you had a comment or a question?
Yeah, just a comment. I've been looking up some other things that she's written, and she translated a book called The Jews of Europe. And I'm still getting through it. But I was really interested in, having read, already read Deadlock, how I'd just like to know where that might fit in this discussion, and what led to that decision. Maybe just pecuniary, a way to make some money, but it did seem like an interesting, and especially the time it was written, it was right at the cusp of a lot of things that went south very quickly. So thoughts on that, that's all.
I think that you were half right. I mean, I think that Richardson tended to take translation work for money, basically. And I think that she had certain links into certain kind of networks. It means that she would translate certain kinds of things, but I think that it wasn't necessarily by choice. But I think that you can't help but sense sometimes that there is a kind of interplay between the novels and the translations, especially as the sequence goes on, so towards the end. But I think there's probably, I couldn't say more than that.
I just add that I think you can tell from the translation, she never took on translations that she was unsympathetic to the author. I mean, she wouldn't just do anything. She did tend to. So like Robert Neumann was, eventually became an exile because of his differences and resistance to the Nazi regime. Other questions or comments that folks want to jump in and discuss? Because if not, you all know I'm not reluctant in the least to jump in, since we've got access to such a terrific Richardson expert.
I mean, I would love to know, if no one's going to jump in, just to hear people's general reflections, however impressionistic about reading the novel, because as I said, I think in some ways, you said it, Brad, I think it's quite a difficult novel to read, I mean, especially after Interim, which I find to be a novel of such kind of levity in many ways, and it's such a kind of a bright novel and a funny novel. I think Deadlocks can seem quite different in feel, so I'd be really interested just to hear people's very general reflections about what it was like to read the novel.
Phyllis, you wanted to offer a comment?
Well, I did. I found this the most engaging and entertaining, if that's quite the right word for Dorothy Richardson, of the ones we've read so far. And I'm starting to feel like I'm getting her jokes more, and so I'm getting to know her more. I mean, she'll do something like she said, if the somebody's playing the piano, if the performance succeeded, the blissful light flowing from the room out over her distant world must either be shattered by her tacit repudiation of the cheaply devised ditty, or treacherously preserved at the price of simulated satisfaction. And to me, that's like so Miriam, and I'm sure so Dorothy, and it's like she's just giving you little glimpses of herself all through. So I enjoyed that, and I also love her talking about editing the Frenchman's work, having all of us probably had that experience of editing some things, and I love her phoneticisms and the way she plays around with phonetically, described. You can tell she's just she's starting to get in love with language, it seems like to me, and maybe she's always been in love with it, but she's showing it more. So I enjoyed it the most of all the ones we've read.
Veggie boring. So my favorite phrases from Pilgrimage when she's listening to the lecture. So yes, Karen.
Yeah, I'm just building on what Phyllis said, really. I definitely found it the most difficult of the series to read so far. And for me, it didn't quite have the sort of wave that carried me along with each of the other volumes. But having said that, as I got further into it, I realized that there's a sort of depth to this one, which there perhaps isn't in the earlier ones. And one of the things that really caught me is, I think, something we talked about in an earlier session, which is the character of London in the book. And there's some beautiful descriptions of what it feels like to be in London and to be moving around London, and particularly equating London with both freedom and with isolation and solitude. So I think that's a kind of counterpoint to some of the dialogues that she's having, and indeed the reflections in places like the quote that you read earlier, Adam, where she's in a crowd and she's kind of observing the masses and the conventional behaviors of people in their gendered roles. When she's moving around London, for example, at the beginning of chapter 9, she says, I thought this was a great sentence, the power of London to obliterate personal affairs depended upon unlimited freedom to be still. And again, at the very end of the book, she talks about the strange, unfailing freedom of solitude in the sounding spaces of London. So I kind of feel that character of London really emerges in Deadlock, and providing a kind of alternative way of life to the conventional gendered roles that we see when we're observing kind of activity in daily life. So yeah, that was just something that was quite powerful for me with Deadlock.
Just say that I completely agree. It doesn't open itself up at the start, right?
That was how I felt.
Yeah. Especially I think if you start revolving lights, it's opening the doors in effect right from the very beginning. I mean, just her choice of how she's opening the discussion really dramatically changes. And if you love the London scenes, there are many more to come, and they're just some fabulous. I mean, London is such a central character in Pilgrimage, particularly in the central part. The books we are in and we'll be going through. And for those of us who haven't any experience of, walking down Euston Road from the station to the British Library or to King's Cross, St. Pancras, every time I read these things, I'm thinking, I'm kind of like doing one of those parallel projections of the past and present in those parts of London and seeing what they were like. And this book is fabulous for that.
I think that what I felt, just to kind of round that off, was that as you were speaking about being in a crowd and losing your sense of being an entity, there's this sense of herself, which really comes into being when she is still and also moving in London. So the role that London plays in helping her develop her sense of self is fascinating.
As Phyllis put in a comment in the chat about unlimited freedom to be still as a wonderful aspect, a concept that comes out in Deadlock. And going home to the sanctity of her room. Yeah, I mean, those are those two kinds, as Adam mentioned, the contrast between the public space and the private space, and how much we need that psychologically to kind of rebuild our defenses as much as, I mean, there's just so much going on. I mean, when you go out in public, you are both visible and in a big city in particular. I mean, this is something a lot of, an interesting aspect of fiction. If you think about, as a contrast, something like Winesburg, Ohio, a small town where everybody knows everybody and everybody knows what everybody else does. Whereas you walk out the front door in London and turn the corner and you're effectively anonymous, which is powerful in one way, but also kind of, draining in other ways. And I think that, Richardson, I think, does such a wonderful job of bringing out that kind of perspective.
It's true, but I think that one of the interesting sort of shifts is that she's learning that it's not just in that those private rooms, which in the earlier novels are the spaces where she can kind of sense selfhood and sort of actualize who she is. But I think that something's starting to move in this novel, that she's starting to, that was such a brilliant example to give, the ability to be still, that she's starting to work out that she can kind of be herself in a public situation as well, and have that kind of circle around her that distinguishes where she ends and the world begins. I think that's something that Richardson's kind of working with, and that I think becomes more important as the novel moves on. And then I think, again, sorry, as a kind of spoiler for those who haven't read it, becomes such an important point of reference for the Quaker episodes in the very late novels of the sequence, Dimple Hill and March Moonlight. So I think that it's something sort of starting to shift in this novel very slightly, which is really fascinating.
I just want to pull in a couple of comments we're getting from the chat, although we have somebody's on as iPad. If you can just chime on in, and we're happy to have you join the conversation.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, it asked for my name. I don't know why. And so it had iPad in there. And anyway, it screwed up. I had a question about on page 194, when she and Michael are exploring their relationship. And I think this is like right after he's confessed that he's had a prior relationship, but also then like before, she kind of more seriously entertains the idea of being his wife. And so it's in the middle of page 194, and he says, "We cannot be as boy and girl, but we may be very happy." And I was just kind of confused about why he says that, because, clearly later on, I mean, I can understand if he thought initially, because he'd had these prior relationships, that she might be reticent to have a relationship with him. But I mean, clearly then not long later, they start talking about having a relationship. So I was just curious why he would say that. Does anybody know?
I see. Go ahead, Adam.
I think that is because the revelation is that he's he has had experience with prostitutes before, so that they can be boy and girl, as if because the virginity is not a and exclusiveness is not an issue for them. That's how I would read that moment. But
See,
I could be wrong.
Max, did you want to chime in on this? Yeah, you're on mute.
Max.
No, I had a different question. So
okay, well, let's get my just response to that is, I think Michael was using the term boy and girl kind of in the convention of romance at that time, where in effect both of the boy and girl would essentially been virginal, and he's kind of saying we're going to have to go into this as grown-ups, sort of, at least on my part. I've been around. It's funny. Last night, my wife and I were watching the Mary Tyler Moore show, and there was a scene in which somebody makes a comment to Mary as if she's a virgin, and she says, "Well, I'm not really that saved," which was kind of shocking to hear for a show from the 70s. Anyway, any more about that scene with Michael?
Neil.
No, I was interested in their dialogues about individualism versus being part of a group. And I think that filters in very nicely with what we've already discussed here, but that's all really.
Okay. Max, you had a question?
yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Adam, for that fantastic introduction to the book, which was really interesting, I thought, and particularly the idea about the double timeline that you were sort of talking us through, and it got me thinking about what to do with it, really. I mean, about whether, how much you think it's something Richardson is implying in the way she's writing, and how much she wants us to read what she's saying about 1900, 1901, around there, I think, against the time of writing or the time of reading, because it's very, it's partly the sort of pre-war and post-war parallels or divergences, isn't it, that if you read the story about sort of people who are French or German or Russian in 1919, it reads very differently from how it would have been received or how people would have thought about those nations in 1901. So I suppose what I'm asking in a sense is, were you wanting to take it further than the kind of biographical interest of sort of what Richardson was doing at the time she wrote this book, and sort of think of it as a double perspective she wants us to bring to the reading as well?
It's a really, really difficult question. I think that because of the
sorry, it wasn't supposed to be.
But it's a very difficult question, because I think that the complexities of, especially at this moment where, before she's writing pretty regularly, but after this, I think things become more complex. And if you look at the timeline of the publications, they start to spread out. And I think that in that sense that, I think that you could say, no, there isn't too much of a parallel, because so much of the circumstances of the writing are based in contingencies. And, if you read the letters, you can start to sense at this moment the interruptions of her life and the difficult life that she has, and her husband's illnesses start to get in the way of her ability to write, as well as her becoming a person who's in demand to write about things, stops her getting to actually do the things she wants to do. So in that sense, I think it's hard to kind of think that there's a kind of concentrated effort to read back from these particular moments to those earlier moments. But it is immensely seductive to do that, to do so. And I agree with you about the sort of striking contrast for talking about nationhood and Jewishness and Russian identity, in comparison from 1920 to 1900. There's something sort of very powerful there. Which was brought out, I think, earlier on in, for example, in Pointed Roost, where the accident of the reception sort of coinciding with the First World War means all of the depictions of Germany take on this very different hue. So I don't think they're kind of by design, but often by accident, that the kind of reception gets sort of absorbed back into it. But I think it's too. I wouldn't say, I certainly wouldn't say that she's a person who is sort of looking at her source material and thinking, how can I make this relevant to my present moment in 1920 or 1925? I don't think that her process is quite working like that, but I think it's impossible not to see those kinds of just those kind of entanglements. That's a bit of a mealy-mouthed answer because I think it's a very difficult issue.
No, sounds about right though.
Yeah.
Just to offer another observation, which is that in terms of where she was within the context of what was going on culturally and particularly in the world of literature, at this point, she's now contributing to things like the Little Review. We soon have Close Up coming in the future. So she is a lot more kind of in the context of her literary world than when in the first books, where she was really pretty much a solo, isolated artist, so to speak. And in fact, as you see in the letters, and it's a shame that we don't have, or at least they haven't published the letters that are before whenever we really pick up in the Windows on Modernism book, but the fact that she had to be aware of what so much more was going on around her in terms of literary development, 1922 with Ulysses and The Wasteland and these sort of things. She was not oblivious to those things. So it's, from this point forward, that context is in the back of the mind, even though, as she operated, because she was so poor and living on such a threadbare existence, she was in many ways just, practically isolated from the mainstream of what was going on. But she was certainly aware of it, fabulously aware of it.
But this is the kind of interesting thing that I think at this moment in her career, she's really sort of starting to realize the power of those kinds of personal connections as well as the literary ones, So this is the point where I think around this time when Deadlock's written, she encounters Briar, who becomes, her greatest sponsor, her greatest supporter, her greatest advocate. And I think that, the Little Review, I think, is the beginning of this kind of process where I think she's very aware of the kind of pickup of what we today call, international modernism. And she's sort of wants to sort of, as you say, kind of make people aware of the fact that she was kind of, she was ahead of the curve in some respects, and she wants to be kind of seen to be a part of that kind of crew, and also to sort of take the benefits that come with it, which are more publication, potentially more opportunities for a bit of money, and more recognition and a wider readership. So I think that she's certainly not kind of innocently sort of surfing the crest of a wave. I think she's sort of really swimming with the tide.
Yeah, right. I just want to bring in a comment from the chat to go back to the question of public and private spaces. Rebecca Mooney points out the scene where Miriam comes back from spending the holidays with her family, and Michael is there to greet her, and she's kind of a little bit thorny in the response because she really would like to have that experience of walking anonymously through the city back to their rooming house and not having to be yet, immediately back into another relationship that she's got to converse. And it's a great thing to point out in terms of how she, shows that you develop the need for that anonymous experience when you become a citizen in a city.
No, I think it's a fascinating thing. I mean, for me, I think that in a way, those kind of ideas are the ideas of the earlier novels, and what this novel is starting to show us is that something is coming up against that. So she's in this very intense relationship with another person, and suddenly her sort of perhaps solipsistic ideas of her own selfhood are being challenged in a way, you know. So I think this is a great dramatization of that point where she can't sustain that kind of isolation anymore, and so she's kind of got that core, that center, but the novel showing us the points where being in a relationship with someone, or indeed being in a relation in various kinds of social or political relationship with many other people, stops you being able to be that sort of private interior self that she's kind of cultivated earlier on. You know, it's a part of her development and her becoming mature, I think.
Right.
So it's a great moment to note.
Just another comment from the chat from Jennifer Braun, asking how international was her world. It's fascinating to read this novel as she uses mirrors of otherness to look at herself in Britain. I think, just for the record, Dorothy Richardson herself only left England on 3 occasions, and they're all in pilgrimage, but only 2 of them are really explicitly dealt with. And so we have Pointed Roofs, which is her time in Germany, and then Oberlund, which we'll be dealing with in August, which is her trip to Switzerland, which was paid for by her employer, the dentist. But there's a 3rd trip, which is only mentioned in passing in Deadlock and several other volumes. Somewhere along the way between Pointed Roofs and Deadlock, she took a trip to Belgium and spent some amount of time in Brussels and also probably Ostende. And they're just such glancing references to that, which is fascinating. But I mean, for those who are interested in the parallels between Pointed Roofs and Villette, I don't know anything else about that. I don't know if I actually didn't go digging in Fromm's biography to see if there's any mention of that. But there are definitely suggestions that at some point Miriam took a trip that's involved some time in Belgium.
I think that, am I wrong in saying that she also went to Paris in the 1920s?
Yes, you're right. You're right.
Very
briefly.
Either met or nearly met Hemingway at that point. So there was that too.
I mean, she was definitely connected with the whole, through her acquaintances. She knew numerous people who were in the midst of what was going on with the left bank and the whole Paris scene of the 20s, the avant-garde.
Yeah, I think even as Pilgrimage shows us, that, you know, the London that Richardson and that Miriam Henderson is immersed in, of the turn of the century, is a sort of strikingly international place, and there are many exiles and emigrants converging in the kind of intellectual culture that she's you know, and the sort of housing culture she's involved in. These lodging and boarding houses are very international. So although I think her own movement is relatively minimal, and she's sort of very much locked in Britain, and indeed sort of a few parts of the south of Britain, I think the connection she has are kind of relatively international.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think about who passes through the doorway at Mrs. Bailey's over the course of the time, you know, Russian, Pole,
Canadian,
French, Canadians, yes, absolutely, Belgian, and a few ambiguously European people. So yeah, I mean, it was really the economic center of Europe, to much greater extent than Paris was, or say Berlin was. Overwhelmingly the dominant commercial center of activity, and consequently international city. Yes, in some ways more then than now, perhaps.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, you know, what, again, whether these sort of parallels are intentional or accidental, but I mean, you know, you get her and Chatov reading Anna Karenina in the British Museum reading room in this novel, and this is the moment, you know, where the Constance Garnett translations of the great Russian novelist, you know, of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Chekhov are starting to have a kind of pickup, and so I think that there's these kind of incredible parallels there. That kind of, there's a kind of internationalism of the intellectual culture that they're absorbing in the novel, and that has a kind of interesting parallel again with the sort of 20 years later that she's writing from.
Do we know which translation of Tolstoy they would have been looking at? Because he makes a comment about Bozhe moi, which is a kind of a utterance, a Russian utterance. And so I looked up the various translations that were available up to and including Garnett, and none of them seemed to have that phrase.
Were there English translations of Anna
Oh,
Karenina
yes,
in 1900?
absolutely. Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And what was interesting is that there were several that were, so there was one that I don't remember the name of the translator. I mean, it was War and Peace became an international bestseller quite early after it came out. So there were several kind of quickly produced translations. I know there was one by an American woman named Clara Bell, who actually translated it from the French, I think. So it's kind of there was a fair amount of that going on those days. If I don't know Russian, I'll translate from somebody else's, portmanteau language. So yeah, there was definitely, but Constant Garden was certainly the one that, because, well, you had, I guess, the Maud's translation as well. Aylmer Maude was about the same time frame. Anyway, any other comments? We're coming up on the hour, and it's been fascinating. Every time we have these discussions, we bring out so many nuances that I would keep this going for hours. But out of respect for people's times, let me just open it up. If there are any last comments, please raise your hand or type in your question in the chat.
If you don't, I have one question I always love to ask people who've read this novel, which is, although I think in a way it's a kind of peripheral, marginal scene in the novel, I think one of the best moments in all of Pilgrimages in this novel, which is the gramophone scene when at Christmas. I just wondered whether anyone had any thoughts about that, because I'm endlessly fascinated by this. I think this is the moment where many writers like Joyce and Proust and then moving forward a little bit, people like Virginia Woolf and Ralph Ellison are sort of fascinated and representing those new audio technologies. And I just think it's extraordinary, that moment. I just wondered whether anyone had noticed that or whether it just passed them by.
Well, the one thing that, just for my own reaction to it, is that what she shows, I mean, we can hear gramophone recordings now that have been digitized and put online and et cetera. But what she shows is they sounded terrible back then too.
Yeah. You can actually, they have digitized the exact recording that they're listening to.
Oh, really?
In that scene, so you can listen to it. I think it's the University of California at Santa Barbara, which has this amazing resource. So you can listen pretty much you can be Miriam Henderson if you want, but by listening to this very scratchy recording.
Just Adam, if you happen to come across the link to that, if you could email it to me, and I'll make it available to everybody. I know we'd be interested. As I'm putting together the music, the music list posts, I do try to put in a variety of the original or early gramophone recordings, and then better quality ones from now, so you get a flavor of that. But I mean, just yeah. But the amazing thing is that we forget. There's a wonderful movie called The Gray Fox. Just to diverge for a second, there's a wonderful Western movie called The Gray Fox, which is about basically an old train robber who gets freed, and he's his last days out. But there's a wonderful scene where he's in this little Canadian town, Western town, where they're showing a movie, and they're showing the Great Train, Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery, and people are, and they're showing this, and one of these guys in the audience suddenly stands up and he shoots at the screen because it was so convincing. It was so vivid. If you've never seen a movie, if you've never seen anything, you don't say, oh, this is scratchy, unbelievable. And the same thing with the recording. I can't believe it's coming out of that machine. So I think just a long-winded way of saying, I think what I like about that in Richardson is she's giving us a glimpse into the contemporaneous experience of something that we don't get from anybody. I mean, almost nobody else actually gives you that for this particular thing, at least.
Yeah, I mean,
And Max,
yeah,
you had a, go
I
ahead.
was going to say Jennifer Braun on the comment has said it's like it's up there. It's Proust seeing the aeroplane. It's definitely a similar kind of thing. They, as she says, I loved how they had to deal with the technology not being quite right, trying to get the speed right. It's much like our experience today. So I think that's totally right.
Right.
I just had a very quick question, which is, are there recordings of Richardson reading or speaking?
No, I don't think there are. Not that I know of.
Really?
No, I don't think there are any. And that's a sort of something that, in comparison to many of her contemporaries, that's a loss. So no, I don't think there is. I mean, I like one of the things I like about it, because someone's said on the chat, that even through the bad recording, we kind of feel her love of music. I think that one of the things I think that's great about that scene is that it compares to those earlier moments in Pointed Roofs and in Backwater, where she's learning these sort of strange ways of reading, where she actually prefers to read kind of reverie, and she thinks the right kind of reading is a reading where you sort of lose focus for a bit and you drift off and you're not really paying attention, and you have a bit of a little bit of a daydream, and then you kind of click back into gear and sort of 10 pages on and start reading more directly again. I think it's the same here. The thing about the episode I love is that the point where they actually get the technology right, so it sounds how you would imagine it should sound, she kind of gets bored and is not paying attention anymore. But it's when it's sort of a bit wonky and a bit off that she's really paying attention. And I kind of love that she's giving us these different ways to interact with art.
While we're here, I just want to throw out one last question that I had written down. And it's because you mentioned the fact that Richardson was considering or trying to get somebody interested in serializing the novel. And that's a question of her choices of chapter structure. I don't know if anybody has actually studied that in particular, but she goes all over the place, doesn't she? I mean, she's got 1-page chapters and she's got 50, 60-page chapters. And I just wondered, do we have any sense of why she would organize the material in chunks like that? Or did she even kind of like resist the whole idea of breaking things into chapters?
I think that she kind of, she starts to drift. And I think eventually chapters in any formal sense go out the window. In the first editions anyway, I think that the edition we read, the 38 edition, sort of puts a bit more sort of shape onto what the novel looks like. But in the first editions, she's moving she's really getting away from that. So I think it's just about the material. I've always thought that there's something about the kind of intensity of experience that Miriam's having that responds to the form. So even when something seems quite boring, if you're getting loads and loads and loads of pages out of it, it means it's important. Whereas if you only got a few, it means that it's sort of something she's not sort of intensely responding to in that way. But I don't think it's anything to do with serialization. So I don't think she has a kind of view about, I could put that chunk in that publication or anything.
No, I just mentioned that because if she were to serialize it, it would, if we go back to the Victorian days of serialization, it really does force you to have some kind of consistent chunking of the prose in the novel.
Yeah, no, I think she wouldn't give way on things like that. I get a sense. Fair play to her.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Adam, for joining us and contributing your insights. They're greatly appreciated. And to everybody who's dialed in, just to say that it seems to be the consensus in the chat that a weekday discussion is preferable. So I will be looking at probably the 28th of July as our next session. But we don't have a guest speaker, so please bring your questions, bring your passages to share. Anything up to and including Revolving Lights is open. We're going to have just a little midway pilgrimage fest to share what you've enjoyed and what you've hated about this novel. And I just want to thank everybody who's checked in today. I mean, I just am blown away that the fact that we've had so many folks hang in this part, and I hope that's because, like me, you find this just such an extraordinary novel that you want to share that experience. So with that, thank you, everybody, and we will see you in about a month.
Thanks a lot, Brad.
Thank you, Adam. Cheers, everyone.
Bye.